A document briefly appeared on a government server late last night. It was uploaded quietly, without announcement, at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time. 9 minutes later, it was removed. No press coverage, no explanation. But during that narrow window, 3 congressional researchers accessed it, saved it, and shared it internally. What was inside that document explains why, right now, the United States is functioning without a stable chain of command. Before this goes any further, understand this clearly. This is not rumor, not punditry, not speculation. This is a constitutional failure unfolding in real time, documented by the government itself. And none of it is being discussed on cable news. Before explaining what the document contained, you need to understand 3 events that occurred within an 18-hour span. Events that appear unrelated unless you know what to look for. A classified security briefing that triggered continuity of government procedures, a financial market signal that historically appears only before wars or internal regime crises, and a quiet legislative maneuver that gives Congress a way to bypass presidential authority entirely. Each happened independently. Together, they point to the same conclusion. The federal government is preparing for a scenario where the president cannot be constrained through normal constitutional means. Early Wednesday morning, just after 6 a.m., the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff convened an emergency meeting at the Pentagon. This meeting was not on any public calendar, no press was notified, but multiple defense officials have confirmed not only that the meeting occurred, but that a specific phrase was used repeatedly during the briefing: continuity of government protocols. That phrase is not symbolic. It is not rhetorical. It refers to the constitutional and military framework used only when the normal chain of command is expected to fail due to catastrophic events: nuclear attack, decapitation strikes, mass casualty terrorism. The last time it was formally invoked was September 11, 2001. When military leadership reviews these protocols, it means they are planning for a breakdown in lawful authority. 3.5 hours later, at 9:30 a.m., financial markets opened. Almost immediately, Treasury yields spiked sharply. To most people, that looks like noise. To institutional investors, it's an alarm. Within minutes, Goldman Sachs distributed an internal risk memo to major clients. That memo was leaked before noon. Buried inside was a phrase that made veteran traders stop cold: institutional risk elevated to Category 4. Category 4 is the highest internal designation used by the firm. It is reserved for only 2 conditions: war or coup. Not recession, not political instability, not elections. War or coup. That memo circulated at 9:30 in the morning. By mid-afternoon, something even more unusual occurred. Senate leadership invoked a rarely used procedural mechanism hidden inside Senate Rule 22. No press release, no speeches, just a notation in the congressional record. The maneuver allows the Senate, under emergency conditions, to fast-track legislation without presidential approval. It creates a path for Congress to act alone if the executive branch is deemed unresponsive or dangerous. 3 branches, 3 separate actions, all within 8 hours, all preparing for the same contingency. Now we come to the document itself. Its official title was Memorandum on Presidential Authority Limitations During National Security Emergencies. It was authored by the Office of Senate Legal Counsel, a nonpartisan body staffed by constitutional lawyers whose sole responsibility is to advise the Senate on the lawful limits of power. This office does not speculate, it does not posture, it does not publish inflammatory language. That's why what it wrote matters. The memo was divided into 4 sections. The first examined the tension between Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution. Article 1 grants authority to Congress. Article 2 grants authority to the President. The question the memo addressed was simple but explosive. When those authorities collide during an emergency, which prevails? The memo grounded its answer in precedent, most notably a Supreme Court case from 1952, Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. In that case, President Truman attempted to seize control of steel mills during the Korean War, citing national security. The Supreme Court rejected the move. The ruling was explicit. Even during wartime, even when national security is invoked, the president cannot exceed constitutional limits or override congressional authority. That decision has defined executive power for over 70 years. Every president since has operated within its boundaries. The memo argues that this precedent empowers Congress not merely to advise or restrain the president, but to override emergency actions outright when they threaten constitutional order. Section 2 of the memo states that the Senate retains the authority to nullify emergency declarations by simple majority vote. This directly conflicts with the National Emergencies Act of 1976, which grants presidents wide discretion. The memo's argument is that constitutional authority cannot be permanently delegated away. Congress can reclaim it at any time. But it was Section 3 that caused the document to vanish. On page 7, the memo states that in circumstances where executive actions threaten constitutional order, Congress possesses inherent authority to temporarily suspend military command transfer pending judicial review. That sentence matters. It outlines a legal framework for removing command authority over the armed forces from the president, not symbolically, operationally. This is not academic theory. This is a blueprint, and it is why the White House objected and demanded the document be pulled. Yet almost no one noticed what came next. The final section of the memo listed 14 names. All were senior career officials from the State Department's Office of the Legal Advisor. These are not political figures. They serve across administrations. They interpret international law for the United States government, and within hours of the memo's release, all 14 submitted resignation letters simultaneously. That office does not resign en masse. When it does, it signals one thing: they will not provide legal justification for what they believe is coming. At the Pentagon, something similar occurred. Joint Staff Legal Advisors circulated internal guidance titled Distinguishing Lawful from Unlawful Orders. This material exists in training manuals, but it is not distributed to senior command during peacetime unless leadership anticipates contested orders. The guidance was sent to generals and legal counsel, not junior officers. These are the people who would have to decide whether to execute or refuse presidential directives. At the same time, multiple intelligence agencies independently restricted the White House's access to sensitive compartmented intelligence, citing handling concerns. Translated from bureaucratic language, it means this: they do not trust the president with classified information. When intelligence agencies limit access to the commander-in-chief, it is no longer politics. It is institutional self-preservation, and that brings us to the Senate. Wednesday morning, 6 Republican senators met privately in Mitch McConnell's office. This was not a routine leadership meeting. It included members with deep institutional memory, intelligence access, military experience, and electoral vulnerability. Before the meeting began, Senate legal counsel briefed them on a subject that has almost never been discussed in modern times: criminal liability for legislators who enable unconstitutional acts. Specifically, liability under federal sedition statutes. The message was blunt: if lawmakers knowingly expand emergency powers that are later used to suspend elections or deploy the military domestically, they could face personal criminal exposure, not political fallout, criminal prosecution. That calculation changed everything. McConnell framed the situation in 3 categories: political risk, electoral risk, and legal risk. Political risk, he said, was survivable. Electoral risk was rising but manageable. Legal risk was different. Legal risk is permanent. Once you cross that line, there is no undo button. And with that, the Republican leadership made a decision. The decision made in that room was not symbolic, and it was not about messaging. It was about self-preservation inside an accelerating constitutional emergency. One by one, the senators laid out the data in front of them: polling, intelligence briefings, legal exposure, electoral math. None of it pointed toward loyalty as a viable strategy anymore. One senator explained that internal focus groups in traditionally conservative districts were no longer reacting with anger or enthusiasm, but with exhaustion. Voters did not want to defend emergency declarations. They did not want to argue about military deployments or constitutional brinkmanship. They wanted stability. They wanted predictability. They wanted governance that did not feel like a permanent crisis. Every point of chaos translated directly into lost support, not from swing voters, but from the base itself. Another senator, fresh from a classified intelligence briefing, offered a conclusion without details. The threats being monitored were no longer exclusively external. That sentence changed the temperature in the room. Everyone understood what it meant. Domestic threat assessments had been elevated. When intelligence committees stopped separating foreign and internal risks, it signals a belief that instability is no longer hypothetical. The final calculation came down to liability. The Senate Legal Counsel had walked leadership through specific statutes, explaining that intent and knowledge matter. If lawmakers had reason to believe emergency powers could be abused, and still acted to expand or protect them, they could be exposed. The law does not care about party affiliation. It does not care about loyalty. It cares about evidence and foreseeability. That shifted the frame entirely. The response they agreed on was quiet but deliberate. Not a press conference, not a speech. A formal communication to the White House stating 3 conditions. No expansion of emergency authority without explicit constitutional justification. No coordinated campaigning unless rhetoric de-escalated, and full party support for incumbents targeted by primary challenges. It was a warning without spectacle, but the real action came the next morning. At 8 a.m., Senate Resolution 47 was formally filed. On paper, it appeared procedural. In reality, it was one of the most aggressive assertions of legislative authority in modern history. Its language was precise and devastating. It stated that regardless of any executive declaration, the Senate retains full authority to nullify emergency powers by simple majority vote, effective immediately upon passage. That phrasing matters. Regardless of any executive declaration means the president's position is irrelevant. There is no veto, no signature, no delay. The resolution does not request permission. It asserts jurisdiction. It relies on the Senate's constitutional authority to govern its own proceedings, authority that courts have consistently refused to second-guess. This was not an abstract threat. The resolution created a fast-track mechanism to terminate any emergency declaration. No committee bottlenecks, no extended debate, no procedural stalling, a single vote, 51 senators, immediate effect. And because it is grounded in internal Senate rules, it is immune to judicial review. The legal basis for this maneuver rests in Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, which grants each chamber the power to determine its own rules. The Supreme Court has upheld this principle repeatedly, ruling that internal legislative procedures are political questions beyond the reach of the courts. Once the Senate votes, the outcome stands. The vote count was not close. All Democrats were in favor. 17 Republicans committed publicly or privately. That produced a total well above the threshold required. This was not a rebellion by a narrow faction. It was a supermajority coalition acting with institutional clarity. And there was nothing the executive branch could do to stop it. Threats did not matter. Public statements did not matter. Social media did not matter. Even declaring a new emergency to block the vote would fail, because the Senate could nullify that declaration immediately under the same resolution. Every traditional lever of presidential power was neutralized in advance. That is the moment the situation became genuinely dangerous. History shows that when leaders accustomed to unchecked authority are cornered, they rarely retreat quietly. They escalate. They test boundaries. They seek alternative pathways. The pattern is consistent across countries and decades. Resistance is not calming, it is triggering. One path is concession, a rhetorical retreat, a claim of victory framed as restraint. That outcome requires an acceptance of limits and loss, something history suggests is unlikely. Another path is legal warfare, flood the courts, challenge jurisdiction, issue conflicting directives, create ambiguity so that authority becomes unclear and contested. That approach thrives on delay and confusion. The final path is extra-legal action, declare an emergency under a different statute, invoke internal security powers, frame legislative resistance as illegitimate, force institutions to choose between compliance and confrontation. That path carries the highest risk, but it exists. While this domestic struggle was unfolding, international partners were already responding. In Brussels, NATO convened an emergency military committee session. The agenda item was labeled a political stability assessment of the United States. This had never happened before. Not during Vietnam, not during Watergate, not during contested elections. The alliance was openly evaluating whether the American chain of command remained reliable. At the same time, Allied intelligence services quietly tightened restrictions on shared classified material. The official explanation referenced operational security. The unofficial reality was simpler. Trust had eroded. Allies were protecting their sources from instability inside the alliance itself. In Europe, officials began drafting a framework designed to respond to democratic backsliding. Similar mechanisms had been used against other governments that violated rule of law standards. This framework focused on individuals, not states. The implication was clear. No country is exempt if institutional breakdown crosses certain lines. In Asia, military readiness indicators shifted. Strategic planners were watching closely. A nation distracted internally is a nation vulnerable externally. Timing matters. Signals matter. And nothing in this moment suggested cohesion. For decades, global stability has rested on one assumption, that American governance, whatever its flaws, is predictable. That assumption was being stress-tested in real time, which leads to the unavoidable question, how does this end? There are only a handful of plausible outcomes. The Senate asserts its authority, and emergency powers are curtailed. Legal challenges follow, but fail. The system absorbs the shock, though not without damage. Or the conflict drags through the courts, creating a prolonged period where no one is certain who holds legitimate authority. Or defiance escalates into impeachment, stalemate, and paralysis. Or in the most extreme scenario, executive incapacity is formally declared and contested. Each path carries consequences. None are clean. All leave scars. What matters is not the personality at the center of the storm. It is the precedent being set. Whether constitutional constraints are enforceable in moments of maximum pressure, whether institutions designed centuries ago can still restrain concentrated power, whether law remains stronger than loyalty. This crisis did not begin with a speech or a tweet. It began with a document uploaded for 9 minutes. A legal analysis too dangerous to remain public. A reaction that rippled outward through markets, militaries, legislatures, and alliances. What happens next will not unfold slowly. It will accelerate. Decisions made in hours will shape years, and by the time it becomes obvious to the public, the outcome will already be locked in. At the center of all of this is a reality most people are still struggling to process. This is not a temporary political fight. It is a stress test of whether constitutional systems can restrain power when loyalty, fear, and escalation collide. The machinery of government is not reacting emotionally. It is reacting defensively. Institutions do not move this way unless they believe normal safeguards are failing. The most likely near-term outcome is legal confrontation. Executive authority will be challenged in court. Injunctions will be sought. Jurisdiction will be disputed. Competing interpretations of legitimacy will emerge. Agencies will quietly choose which directives to follow. Some will comply with congressional authority. Others will wait. A few may resist altogether. This creates a fog where authority exists on paper but not uniformly in practice. Courts will be asked to intervene, but courts move slowly unless forced. Emergency dockets compress timelines, but they do not resolve ambiguity instantly. In the meantime, uncertainty becomes policy. That uncertainty is corrosive. It weakens deterrence abroad and confidence at home. Markets react not to outcomes, but to unpredictability. Allies hedge. Adversaries probe. Inside the executive branch, career officials are already calculating exposure. Orders are no longer evaluated solely on legality, but on future accountability. Every signature, every authorization, every enforcement decision carries personal risk. That changes behavior. It slows action. It fragments coordination. Government does not collapse loudly. It erodes quietly through hesitation. The Senate's move was not designed to remove a president. It was designed to draw a hard line. Emergency powers are not personal tools. They are conditional authorities delegated by the legislature and reclaimable when abused. That principle is foundational. If it fails here, it fails everywhere. What makes this moment unprecedented is not the existence of conflict, but the alignment of responses. Legislative action, legal analysis, military preparation, intelligence compartmentalization, market signaling, allied contingency planning. These systems do not coordinate narratives, they respond to risk. When they move simultaneously, it means the risk is no longer theoretical. There is a temptation to frame this as partisan. That framing is convenient and wrong. Partisanship thrives on spectacle. What is happening now is procedural, legal, and structural. It is happening in rooms without cameras, through documents without press releases, via mechanisms most people have never heard of. That is how real power operates when stakes are existential. The Senate resolution once passed does not end the crisis. It defines the battlefield. It shifts the struggle from rhetoric to enforcement, from public messaging to compliance, from loyalty to law. That is why it matters so deeply. If the resolution is respected, a precedent is restored, emergency authority becomes conditional again. Presidents are reminded that constitutional limits are not optional. Institutions regain confidence. Damage remains, but containment succeeds. If it is defied, everything changes. The question becomes not what the law says, but who enforces it. That is the point where democracies either reassert control or slide into something else entirely. History shows that constitutional systems rarely fail all at once. They fail through normalization, through repeated boundary testing, through exhaustion, through moments where the cost of resistance feels higher than the cost of compliance. This is one of those moments. International observers understand this instinctively. That is why assessments are happening now, not later. Stability depends on clarity. Ambiguity invites miscalculation. Miscalculation invites conflict. The next 72 hours matter more than the next 72 days, not because everything will be resolved, but because trajectories will be set. Lines will harden. Choices will be made that cannot be undone quietly. This is not about one individual. It is about whether power remains constrained by law or migrates toward personality, whether institutions act collectively or fracture under pressure, whether fear overrides precedent. A legal memo uploaded for 9 minutes triggered a cascade because it articulated something many inside government already feared but had not formalized. That fear is now operational. What you are watching is not chaos. It is resistance. It is the immune response of a system designed to survive concentration of power. Whether that response is sufficient remains unknown. But make no mistake, this is constitutional history unfolding in real time. Not in textbooks, not in hindsight. Now, understanding it requires looking past headlines and personalities and focusing on structure, authority, and enforcement. That is where the real story is, and that is where the outcome will be decided. The Constitution is not a document that protects itself. It relies on people, institutions, and collective courage to enforce it. This moment will reveal whether that courage still exists. The test has already begun.